So I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Sigall Horovitz from the Minerva family. It's just wonderful to have you in Haifa. Sigall is the Transitional Justice Advisor of the Hebrew University's Clinical Legal Education Center. Her interests are transitional justice, international criminal law, ethics, and anti-corruption. She's held various legal positions at the UN, including the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Special Court for Sierra Leone, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Sigall is also involved in teaching and academic research, both in Israel and in Germany. She initiated transitional justice programs at the Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University, led experiential study trips to Rwanda and South Africa. She completed her master's degree with honors at Columbia University and received her doctorate in law from the Hebrew University. She received the Arthur Helton Fellowship of the American Society of International Law, the Robin Scholarship of the Truman Research Institute for Advancement of Peace, and the Vados Prize of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, and an award for distinguished academic work from the Israeli Law and Society Association. She's a member of the New York and Israeli Bar Associations, founding member of the Association for the Promotion of International Humanitarian Law, and a wonderful person who we're waiting to hear from.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you everyone for being here online or in person. I was a postdoc here, and it's always an honor to be back. And I feel like I never left this family, so it's really nice to be included. It's also an honor to be the first speaker in the seminar series of this year, so thanks for that, Michal and Deborah. I'll jump in. Our topic today is transitional justice and how it relates to Israel and Palestine. We'll talk, about the definition of transitional justice and its relationship to the current context. But before that, I wanted to say a few words about a webinar we organized here with the Minerva Center in cooperation with the Legal Clinical Education Center at the Hebrew University, where I'm affiliated. So we organized a webinar on transitional justice in Israel-Palestine last June, 4 months ago. And there were international and local panelists who spoke for about 3.5 hours in total. And all of them started by being very aware of the problem of speaking about and thinking about transitional justice while the war in Gaza was ongoing. And, some of them really sort of filled up for 8 minutes of talking with how ironic it is for them to even appear and talk about it, but if pushed to say something, they did say something about a possible future. Now, with the opportunity presented by the ceasefire, I think there are many excuses not to talk about TJ, but one less. And we have to seize the moment to really advocate for at least opening a discussion about transitional justice in both societies and across societies. And yes, the ceasefire in Gaza looks pretty fragile. But there is a political process ongoing at the moment, and it creates a certain space to talk about the day after. And in my view, including transitional justice processes and discussions in this kind of day after agenda could ultimately help, promote a lot of the goals that the political process is trying to promote, like sustainable peace, a stronger democracy or democracies, better rule of law, reconstruction. So I'm calling to include TJ in the discussion of the day after. And that's, our topic for today. I think, at the moment, both communities, Palestinians, Israelis, are talking about reconstruction, about rebuilding. Whether it's physical infrastructure, whether it's social contracts, whether it's institutions, whether it's rebuilding trust in institutions and in each other. And transitional justice processes are very well suited to contribute to these rebuilding aims. And yet, transitional justice... Am I sharing?
No, not yet.
And yet, transitional justice is not part of the conversation. I want people to listen. So once there's slides, or just focus on the slides, I'll do it. So anyway, that's the point I want to make today. And there are elements of transitional justice in what's going on today, especially the calls for accountability. You know, in Israel, there's calls for accountability, an inquiry commission to investigate the causes of the October 7th attack. On the Palestinian side, there's efforts to hold Israel accountable in, you know, various international fora, universal jurisdiction, individual criminal accountability of soldiers. There's a lot of these kinds of accountability efforts, but these actions fall short of addressing the broader truths underlying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So the critical questions really that these calls fall short of addressing are, you know, what are the root causes of the conflict? What are the legacies of violence and historical injustice? How can we address these legacies? How can we address the violence to ensure a future that is based on accountability, on justice, on reconciliation? And there's also a lack of a call to sort of self-reflect within each society about, you know, the harms it's been inflicting on the other society. And so, you know, all these things are necessary to find a way to halt and stop the cycle of violence, injustice, and repair the damage, and provide, you know, guarantees that this will not recur. And so that's what I see still as missing in current discussions. Right, so I called the presentation Transitional Justice in Israel-Palestine after the Gaza War, Challenges and Opportunities for Peace Building. I'm not saying the conflict has ended, obviously not, but this little ceasefire, I think, opens the space to talking and discussing these topics. I don't know if it's possible in this hybrid format to have questions kind of in the process of my presentation. People could just jump in. I will also leave time at the end for questions. So for those who are not familiar with the term transitional justice, there's a couple of ways of defining transitional justice. First of all, using the term justice, it's justice that addresses legacies of violence and injustice and is linked to some kind of a political transition, right? It could be a transition from authoritarian regime to a democracy. It could be a transition from war to peace. It could be a transition from something that is not entirely democracy or a democracy to an improved democracy, right? So it does have a direction. It does have a direction to sort of a better democracy, a stronger peace, a more sustainable peace, and reconciliation. And transitional justice is also sometimes defined as a set of tools, a set of mechanisms or processes, right, that are put in place to address past violence while at the same time rebuilding trust, right? So it has this dual function, looking backwards, but also facing forwards. So we're not just like retributive, everyone in jail, because that's not going to help us build a new society, right? So it's not just classical justice, but it does have this rebuilding element. And so that's very important to think about when we think about transitional justice. Not just about the past, but how do we shape a more just, inclusive, and peaceful future? And what does it look like? I mean, here when I'm in a semester-long course and we have a lot of time and there's a lot of students, I put it as an open question. What are the types? What do you see as justice after violence and injustice and legacies and long-term violence? Law students would say punishment and trials. I got that in the first bullet point. Sociology, historians, religious students would have maybe a more sort of broader conception of justice, truth, acknowledgement of harm, acknowledgement of narrative. People who they want a proper burial. They want to know what happened to the missing. That for them is closing, is closure, is justice. Compensation for many is very important. Memory. How do we commemorate? How do we not forget what happened? What violations we suffered? And if anyone wants to kind of butt in with more answers. There are many, many, many conceptions of justice. They're very context specific in terms of what actually happened, what were the injustices, but they're very personal, also personality specific. What does it mean to me personally to get justice for, the violations I suffered?
There's also revenge.
When we talk about revenge, we actually talk about in justice and transitional justice discourse, we talk about the need to substitute revenge or heal or have dissipate calls for revenge. We talk about, law in general is to avoid taking justice in your own hands, right? So retributive justice, trial and punishment, should alleviate these needs, these very natural human needs for revenge, right? But again, when you try to build a future that is reconciled, that is rule of law based, when you think about your children and your grandchildren and how you want them to live, and revenge just brings more revenge, you try to think that long-term vision, what kind of society I want to build. And obviously this is not up to the individual. There is a whole social system, political system that buys in and weighs in and tries to articulate a better future. So that's where revenge comes in, that it has to be acknowledged and dealt with, not ignored. Very, very important. So when we look at transitional justice, not only as conceptions of justice, but also the toolkit, what are the mechanisms, what are the processes? Here also, it's a non-exhaustive list, I would say, but the typical mechanisms would be your trials, different trials, international trials, the ICC, ad hoc tribunals, mixed tribunals, national trials. It could be administrative trials. It could be, proceedings before the regional human rights courts. All these could be considered in a relevant context as transitional justice mechanisms and processes. Truth commissions are very prominent, a very prominent example for a transitional justice mechanism. And these are often called truth and reconciliation commissions. And they're often called actually in many different names. Friendship commission, mechanism for peace. They can be called very, very many different names. There's over 40 of those have been established so far worldwide, and they do each have a different name, whatever resonates locally. But the category would be Truth Commission or Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the idea is obviously, well, not obviously, but the idea here is that truth or truths and uncovering them and listening, deep listening to people's truths of what they experienced will help build reconciliation. And that's why they're often called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. They're pitted against trials sometimes, or historically, traditionally, as different kinds of approaches to justice, but today no longer considered so dichotomous. We'll talk about that. Amnesties and conditional amnesties. This is something also, a lot of these concepts have been raised here in connection with the ceasefire very recently, so I think it's very relevant now to think about amnesties and how do we let perpetrators get away with an amnesty? So we make them conditional. The amnesty is conditional on changing your ways, on acknowledging the harm you have caused, on asking to participate in society again, on maybe providing reparations of some sort. So there's different, the sky's the limit, very creative field of conditional amnesties in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and UK. There's an amnesty law now that is being amended, I think second time now, to address, the troubles, the times of the troubles and the conflict in Northern Ireland. And what do we do with all these cases that are still being investigated? There's still no prosecutions for those who violated and caused killings and harm. Can we give them amnesty? Should we? And what conditions? So these are live discussions in Britain today and in other parts of the world. Commemoration. How do we commemorate, again, while looking to the future? This isn't just we commemorate our own, we are, the only victims, and everybody around us are should be feeling guilty forever. This is not how we commemorate while we're thinking about the future and building, a reconciled rule of law society. Apologies. We see apologies in transitional justice that include some form of acknowledgement. Again, not just, look, I'm sorry it happened to you, but we take responsibility, we acknowledge, we build a better future. Reparations, reforms, vetting is very popular in transitional justice, or illustrations it's sometimes called. It's about an administrative process to remove those from the administration or the military or the police or the judiciary that are affiliated with the darker time of our society or the past violations. So denazification, debuffification, we have all these concepts that we're familiar with, but sometimes a bit more nuanced, and it's an administrative process, so there's rights of appeal or not, depending on the context. Constitution making has also been very prominent in the transitional justice landscape, and I think very relevant in our parts. It's not just adopting a new constitution, but it's also the process of formulating it. How do you include the entire society in that, different parts, and really listen to them? Can be something very sort of uniting, and also establishing the values upon which you want your future society to be based. Other ideas, if we had time, or maybe in the end, we could talk about. And a quick evolution of TJ, of this landscape, of this field, which we can look back to Nuremberg trials and Tokyo trials and talk about them as the first real transitional justice mechanism, even though we didn't have the term transitional justice then. Because again, these were not, okay, everybody who did wrong goes to trial. That was not what happened, right? There's a selective trial that is there to make a point of what's wrong and right, to educate, but also to allow others in society that were perpetrators to actually go back into society and reform. And the term transitional justice was formed only after, only in the late 80s, early 90s, largely based on the Argentinian experience and other experience in Latin America with truth commissions. So in Argentina in 83, the dictatorship fell and the first truth commission was established, which was actually called an inquiry commission, by the way. That then led other countries in that region where dictatorships were giving way to the new democracies to adopt the Argentinian model. Chile, for example, added the word reconciliation in the name of the investigative body, and it called it Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1990. South Africa looked on to Argentina and Chile and said, we want something like that for the end of apartheid. And they sent people there, they studied the model, and they brought it back to Africa, and they created their own Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked very different to the one in Chile and Argentina. And this, we know, is very famous, 1995 here on our timeline, South Africa Truth and Reconciliation. So we move kind of from these trials to truth commissions to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. In the 2000s, we start talking about trials alongside reconciliation mechanisms, right? We had it in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, East Timor, lots of other places. And it's no longer seen as an either or, it's seen as something that's very complementary. And we come to later times from the, latest decade or two, we look at holistic TJ systems. And we look at, a bit of truth commissions, a bit of trials. The trials may be restorative themselves. They may have some form of collective sort of reparations. And then we might have, a reparations mechanism, a commemorations activity. So a very holistic approach, and also in ongoing conflicts before the transition. We're having transitional justice before the transition today, before the complete democracy, before the complete peace. We're talking about TJ as a pre-transition element, as something that will help bring the transition. And this is current times. This is where we are now with the field. So as I said, Argentina was the first case that led to the articulation of the term transitional justice, with the first truth commission. In Israel, if you here may remember, there was in 2000, a little investigation, a little truth commission of our own into the fate of the disappeared in Argentina. There's a lot of Jews who came to Israel that time, and they pressed the government to start inquiring because they had a feeling that some of their relatives were targeted for being Jewish. And I was lucky to be part of that mechanism as a stagiaire in the Justice Ministry and a Spanish speaker. And this is how I came across the field of transitional justice. And a junkie since, a groupie since. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, this broad name that is given to different mechanisms of different names, relate to an official temporary body, which is victim-centered. It's an investigative body, but it's not there to sort of roll heads and find, accountable people necessarily. It might be an offshoot. But their main point is to listen to victims, hear their story, acknowledge their experiences, and see them as right bearers. Really empower them in the sense of these people have the right to some kind of reparation. And the end, they're a very long process, usually with a report of findings and recommendations for reform. There's a lot of data. There's a link here in the slide with a huge data set that came out recently with all the different truth commissions and other TJ mechanisms worldwide. And so we're at the stage of beyond this peace versus justice debate. Peace, I'm seeing as the classic Truth and Reconciliation Commission was pitted against trials. We're beyond that. We're seeing TRCs, truth commissions that are leading to trials, like in Peru and other places. We are seeing TRCs that are done in parallel to trials. We're seeing trials that have a restorative element, like in Colombia today or in Rwanda with the gacaca. The trials sometimes have two heads. If you admit as a perpetrator or suspect and cooperate with the mechanism, you are moving to a restorative channel. You don't go to jail. You maybe have some kind of community service or maybe house arrest as the punishment, but you're brought back to be part of society, as a contributing part of society. But you got to cooperate with the process, reveal the truth, take responsibility, etc. The same mechanism. If you don't cooperate, you go to jail. You get a regular trial under the same mechanism. So we see that it's a very developed form of this concept in Colombia today. It's called the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, post-FARC government peace deal. And in Spanish, it's JEP, the Spanish acronym, so people might know it by the name JEP. In other places, including in the places I said, actually, you have the holistic approach, right? Where you have everything in parallel, including other mechanisms I didn't mention. When you want to take transitional justice to its core pillars, we talk about pillars of transitional justice. You can talk about them as rights of transitional justice as well. And these are truth, justice, reparation, and non-recurrence of violence. So you try to uncover the facts about the past, that's the truth. You try to hold perpetrators accountable, not necessarily through retributive criminal justice. Broad accountability through other social mechanisms are also possible. Reparation, not necessarily only compensation. Reparation could be restitution, rehabilitation, apology, commemoration, some kind of way to repair the harm that victims suffered, help them heal. And non-recurrence, which is a subset of reparation in a way, but it's so important that it was taken as a fourth independent pillar. And that is, what can you do? How do you reform your society, your institutions, to guarantee that these violations are not going to come back, right? And so these four pillars are also talked about as rights of victims, but also rights of societies. And today, in the last, I don't know, it's about a decade or maybe less, in the last few years, the UN had appointed a new rapporteur. You know, there's a rapporteur system under the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. And there's the most recent rapporteur, I think, is the rapporteur for transitional justice. But the title of the role is actually the Special Rapporteur for Truth, Justice, Reparations, and Non-Recurrence, right? In order not to use a concept that is very unclear. Transitional justice, what does it mean? People don't understand the concept. They may argue with these words. They may say it doesn't reflect what we mean, right? So break it down, a very long title to one person. They need a lot of lines in their, slides and documents. So this office is very important. It reaches out to different countries and societies, offers their help in sort of developing transitional justice modalities for that context. It's very interesting and important for us here, institution. We already went through this. What are the key questions when we want to set up a transitional justice process? So how do we address the past while shaping the future? And how do we balance justice and peace? Right? We want justice, but we also want peace. These are actually compatible, and how do we find the right sort of formula? And how do we rebuild this trust in each other and trust in an institution while doing all that? So a lot of questions go into, designing the process or processes. And, a lot of times transitional justice, we say, okay, what are the goals? More truth, more justice. That doesn't really mean a lot, right? More rule of law, fine. But really what we want to promote, and really we could take it down, and I want to attribute this list of 4 points to Pablo de Grief, who spoke in our transitional justice webinar in June, and he was very clear about, not to overpromise with Pablo de Grief. Sorry, for those who don't know, currently he's a commissioner in the Ukraine Inquiry Commission, but he was beforehand the first special rapporteur of the UN for transitional justice, and the president of the International Center for Transitional Justice. So a very sort of top leading expert on this field. And he basically said, let's think about transitional justice as something that promotes recognition of victims, of the harm they suffered, but also of the right bearer, that they are right bearing, that they have these rights, and, they're part of this society in that sense. And that TJ promotes trust with the institutions and each other, and social integration. He said, people say reconciliation, peace, but we really mean some kind of integration of all these different parts of society, and rule of law in terms of human rights, democracy, etc. And it's not that TJ will bring these alone, but it will help these build. So you need a lot of different efforts and processes, and obviously education and political processes and agreements and accords and, different other tools and processes. But transitional justice supports all these other processes and tools, and helps to sustain. Obviously, criticism and challenges are there. Selectivity, why, the government may do what it does to shield itself from accountability. It does, transitional justice only in relation to this group and not to that group, so that's still there and it's valid, and you need to expose it. So when TJ happens, you need to keep making it better. Legitimacy, there was, I think, originally a lot of copy-paste, one-size-fits-all approach to transitional justice mechanisms. I think that's obvious today that it's not the case. So it would look like it's a very sort of exporting something from the West, maybe to a non-Western context, and that would have legitimacy problems, but also a very top-down process, which would have legitimacy concerns. Political influence, again, how is it shaped from the top in a way that maybe does not reveal the whole picture? And then this whole idea of balancing reconciliation and justice. Are we giving amnesty in a way that is really justified by the process, or are we just like letting people get away with murder because they have the power? And then there's the practical concerns and capacity limitations. Practically, do we have government institutions that are able to run these processes? Do we have the resources, even, right? The human resources, the monetary resources. What about capacity limitations, like effectiveness? Is it even effective what we're going to do? So these are very legitimate criticisms and challenges, but I think, there's a tendency in certain circles and literature to throw the baby away with the water, to say, oh, this transitional justice is just a fig leaf, it's just a way to maintain the power relations in asymmetric situations. It's just a hoax. And I think, the more the limits and the shortcomings of the processes is revealed, the better the process can become. And so the process can be fine-tuned as it's ongoing. And the design of the process also needs to have a very inclusive approach, right, to flesh out all these blind spots and improve them. And so we need to have a lot of contextualization, a lot of inclusion in the process, and as holistic as possible. Go as holistic. Have not just legal approaches, have social approaches, economic approaches, and keep adding and keep, improving. And here we come to Israel-Palestine. I'm good on time, yeah. If there are any questions, just let me know because I'm not seeing that necessarily on my side. And here we come to us. I mean, I've tried to really emphasize until now elements of the slides that I thought would ring a bell locally. And, transitional justice is relevant. Obviously, there's a conflict, right? If transitional justice is there to help resolve conflicts, yeah, this is a place for it. Society is very polarized. Even if you look within, the Palestinian society, the Israeli society, of which we are part here, is very polarized, extremely polarized. And it might actually be useful to talk about transitional justice mechanisms internally in Israel. There's a lot of feelings of victimhood here, different parts of society. This isn't only the Arab-Jewish rift, where transitional justice, you asked me and I've written about it, is very, very relevant. But it's other cleavages in Israeli society that are based on claims of victimhood that could be amenable to transitional justice processes. And weak trust in each other, obviously, but also in institutions, right? The breakdown of institutions, of trust, democratic decline, and the constitutional crisis. I mean, these are the contexts in which transitional justice was initiated elsewhere, right? So if not here, then where? And then we have the involvement of international judicial bodies like the ICJ and the ICC. I mean, they're involved in the first place because this is a setting in which these are the kind of violations that transitional justice has historically addressed. Now, once these institutions are involved, this also triggers usually a national response, either as a way to kind of circumvent international justice processes and take ownership over them, make them better because they're more contextualized. They're more contextualized once they're done at home. They could be more victim-centered. They could be more, relevant in terms of the terminology and the language and the process to local audiences, more meaningful. And also, the international judicial processes could spark not only an answer nationally that aims to circumvent the international system, but also to complement, right? So the big fish go to The Hague. What do we do with a small fish? Division of labor. Or, that's a very retributive or very administrative process in The Hague. Here we have a more restorative process, right? So these are in settings where there's a little less hostility to what's going on in The Hague. Maybe in a local context, we're not seeing ourselves as complementing, but rather taking over the process to make it more relevant and legitimate locally. And there is a very big opening for that, at least in the ICC with the principle of complementarity, but also in the ICJ that has, a dialogue in it and a relationship with the country. So it's a bullet point. It's got a bullet point of its own there. I want to say something about the TJ language. And I wrote here in the bullet point that it gives hope or an entry point to discuss these issues. And I think we need a new language here. I think we're stuck, right? We're very stuck within Israeli society and across Israeli and Palestinian. I'm not going to talk on behalf of Palestinian society because I'm not part of that society, but across, the boundaries, the Israeli-Palestinian context is very stuck in terms of how do we move forward. And even talk of ceasefire is really focused on Gaza. What about the West Bank? What about Palestinians in Israel? What about everything else that's going on, And so we're stuck about that. We can't even see October 7th and the war since then as part of the conflict that started in 48 in some parts in Israel, right? So I think we need kind of a new perspective, a new framing. And in my mind, in my view, transitional justice being so on the border of sociology, and law, it's not very rigid like law. It's much more, in the political realm, it's much more flexible. Even the notion of justice, it's a flexible it's a context specific. I mean, it's very important. You don't want to dilute it, but it's very broad. It's a very broad base. It wants to contain a lot in it. And it gives power to this discipline of teaching. It gives it power to be more relevant and to help unstuck, right, this situation. So I hope that here I raise awareness to this field of transitional justice and its potential to provide new language, new ideas, new concepts that are creative, and each society would think for their own about how it's going to look and draw on their own experiences historically. If we look here, and we spoke on the way about tikkun, about tshuva. In Arab societies, we talk about sulha. I'm just talking locally. And there's a lot to draw on in terms of how historically the societies here have dealt with situations of conflict in a restorative way, right? And at the same time, there is so much global experience that has accumulated in the last, 40, 50 years that is now also being systematized, researched. Typologies are there. There's a special repertoire for that. There is so much best practices to look for inspiration, not for copy pasting, but to inspire you. It's huge, it's vast. So I really think this can give some hope in our situation. And my last bullet point, again, attributed to Pablo de Grief in our webinar in June, and I really encourage all of you to see the recording. We are now editing the 3.5-hour recording of the webinar so that it will become a very attractive, viewer-friendly 30-minute film, right? Hopefully coming soon. And one of the very powerful things that Pablo de Grief said was, it's never too early for transitional justice, because that's, the usual. We're in a conflict. We're, too much violence, too much pain. Who can even think about transitional justice? No, he says it's never too early. He gave the example of Colombia, but also Argentina. We mentioned the Truth Commission in Argentina that was founded in 1983. When the dictatorship took power in Argentina in the 70s, 76, the junta, the military junta, the same year, activists already started gathering evidence, documenting crimes, supporting victims. Supporting victims, by the way, not only helps them heal from their trauma, but it makes them part of the process of seeking for justice, right? We talked about legitimacy deficit or concerns with PJ. When victims are part and parcel from the outset, they help shape the process, maybe after the transition or when we're closer to the peace and democracy, and they're part of it. They're already sort of integrated.
Anne has a question.
And just to finish my sentence, that it's been crucial in places like Argentina and Colombia. There's 2 articles coming out on Argentina soon. Alejandro Checkman, the Dean of Law of Ditela. I have the drafts with me, and they are amazing because it's exactly what we're lacking in this field. And it really outlines how those early efforts by civil society to document, generate evidence, support victims during the dictatorship were directly credited for the transitional justice process later on, for the Truth Commission, and now the trials in Argentina. All that would probably not have happened without those civil society actors and the victims right at the outset during the roughest times of the dictatorship. And now the question.
Hi, thanks so much, Sigall. That was, as always, fantastic. I want to pick up what you just said and what Pablo said on our webinar. And it's never too early for TJ. And he especially refer to evidence gathering. And I'm wondering, because I just don't know, it's really a question. When I think about the things going on in the West Bank, who is actually gathering the evidence? We know that there were no foreign journalists allowed in Gaza. Who is actually gathering the evidence in a way so that it is credible for both sides? And I just wonder. It's really just a question, because if you don't find a consensus on what facts to accept, then I think the whole TJ process can go wrong. So what's happening currently in Israel to have good credible evidence gathering?
Excellent question, and I'll also let others around this table answer. I will say that there are groups, like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence. They're definitely in the West Bank, but they're also in contact with different actors in Gaza. We've got today this, and still useful in Gaza. And we have in the West Bank, boots on the ground of these organizations. We have journalists, Haaretz. We have other journalists as well, even in mainstream media in Israel, very, very few, but some. We have Palestinian journalists, very brave. We have, I'm blowing my nose, I'm sorry. We have, I mentioned B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, but there are many groups. There are many groups pushing also for TJ beyond the documentation part, but many are speaking out about what's going on. There are individuals who are giving testimonies. There are international bodies collecting testimonies. The Inquiry Commission in Geneva, ICC is working on collecting evidence, investigating both sides, all sides. I think there's a multitude of efforts. I wonder if anyone is mapping all these efforts. Probably there are people mapping the efforts, but it's a great question. And then it could go wrong, you're saying, if we don't have the right evidence, right? So while process is ongoing, while you have, after initiating transitional justice processes, it's always important to keep an eye on it. You're going to have the civil society actors who are going to be, the watchdogs. Once the process is starting, you got to also be always critically thinking about it to improve it, to flesh out the blind spots, right? I don't know if anyone here wants to add anything.
Yeah. If I can just quickly follow up, Sigall. So and maybe my perspective is wrong, but from what I gather is that, for example, the UN commissions of inquiry are not viewed as legitimate in Israel. So whatever they gather, whatever they report, would not necessarily be accepted by the population. And you need somehow the population and the civil society actors in. Everyone needs to be in to have a successful TJ process. And so I wonder if that is not accepted. I wonder also on given what's going on politically on the Israeli NGOs like B'Tselem, how legitimate are they viewed in Israel by the population?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand how that can come together. And in Yugoslavia, whatever the ICTY said, if you went back 5 years later, 10 years later to the Serbian population, they wouldn't accept it. It's a very difficult psychological process, and they would just say, well, whatever they gathered, that was wrong.
Right.
So
there's a time. I mean, you're saying what's done in Geneva, what's done in The Hague is not accepted now. But when you talk about who's collecting the evidence, they're collecting evidence. I mean, whether it's accepted or not, when is another question. But you just asked who's collecting the evidence. They're collecting the evidence. The journalists are, the NGOs that maybe the mainstream at the moment don't really like, local NGOs, and the ICC and all that, are collecting evidence. This evidence will be useful. It is something to draw on later and something to challenge later as well. Like in any sort of truth-seeking process, it'll be used. It'll be used in any trial locally. It'll be used. Whatever's public or whatever's accessible will be used. And you know, there's no TJ here now, obviously, but that's where it's being documented. And you know, the clinics I work with at the Hebrew U, they're documenting in East Jerusalem. They're representing Palestinians in human rights cases and living their life story for that year that the students are working with. That's documentation. That's there. It doesn't have to be acceptable or legitimate at the moment. So I think, yeah, it's important to note that. Did that answer all the questions? Yeah, in Yugoslavia, yeah. There's wars over narratives still, of course. And then Robert wanted to weigh in. I think Robert wanted to weigh into this discussion.
Yeah, first of all, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so first of all, I'll take a minute to say hi to everybody. It's been a while since I've been here. Thank you for the presentation, Sigall. My question to you is, are there some preconditions to TJ to work? Why do I ask it? It goes even before the issue of the question and questions about the mechanism and who collects evidence. But the question is, for example, can TJ work on a partial basis? Because it's nice to think about the Gaza situation, who's got us there, who's done wrong, but we're living the entire conflict. We have a huge conflict, and just taking just part of it and trying to deal with it. For example, is it applicable in this situation, or in more loudly speaking, is there a need that all sides want, like, have a vision which is shared by everybody? Is it something that should be like, can TJ work in any circumstances? That's basically my question. Thank you.
I think I want to point out that I'm not done with my slides yet. And that, Robert, your question is perfect. And it really leads the way to my next slides. Before I do that, I want to see if anyone has a question on these issues, on how does it work? Can it be partial? What are we talking about in the context where nobody wants it in the government, right? That's basically, Robert, what you're saying. Of course, I can answer your question in length about examples, you know, where they started. Like I just mentioned in Argentina, obviously it was not called Transitional Justice. They were collecting evidence. They were deposing witnesses. They were helping mental health-wise witnesses and victims. This is kind of a pre-TJ, right? It happened. So there's lots of, I worked in Rwanda, I worked in Sierra Leone. I can give you a lot of examples from my own work, but I want to wait for the next few slides because I think in a structured and concise way, they will answer your questions. So it's a really great lead-in. I wonder if we should take Nadiv and Eli just now for a second before we continue with the next slides. So we were in this slide, right? It's relevant. We all agree it's relevant, but, you know, we can dream on. So what? No, it doesn't work. Okay, so obstacles. Like we just said, no political will, there's an ongoing conflict, transition, not even near, and there's no vision of coexistence. There's not even an imagination. You know, it's a point made also in our TJ webinar by Shiri Krebs, an Israeli professor in Australia, and she said, look, how can you even talk about it when there's not even a vision, an imagination by population of a shared future, right? And lack of commitment to equality is also some of what she was talking about. There's no commitment to equality. There's like Jewish superiority, right? Jewish supremacy. That's the paradigm. Nobody's thinking about like equality in a real sense here. Of course, I'm in the mainstream, right? And also part of her point was there was a zero-sum thinking. Some of the other speakers also talked about it. Dani Baltal, who was also in our webinar. And so you have to move beyond this, right? How can you do it? It's not just the political will. It's also from below the population, the ethos, the ideology, the indoctrination, the concepts are not amenable to even starting or talking about teaching. So here is the solution, or here's the way to overcome these challenges. And this, you know, when you have no state involvement or will, and the state doesn't want to do teaching. Can you still do teaching? Robert, I think is part of what you were asking. And so we start thinking about this transitional justice. So this TJ that comes before the transition. Ruthie Taita also was in our webinar. She spoke about this and she called it anticipatory TJ, right? So maybe the example from Argentina would be called that, right? Anticipatory. And maybe that's all we can do, right? And that's where the relevant actors are not the state. I mean, the state could help, or maybe a local municipality, you know, there's some projects we could talk about. But the real relevant actors here, the main drivers will be civil society organizations, that's my CSO there, academia. Academia could develop models, right? Let's do a study of how TJ could look like here. What are the concepts we can use locally? What are the models we can use locally? That could be an academic project. Religious leaders, you know, we talk about interfaith, but interfaith is not just let's hold hands and build a future. It's also about let's talk about what we did to each other, right? And how leaders, religious leaders in this area have so much weight, so much power. Not, you know, it's not a mistake that it's mentioned in, you know, Trump's 20-point plan, right? The religious interfaith idea of dialogue. Educators have a role. Global actors. So there you have your ICJ, your ICC, your UNGA, and other actors that they're basically being used and invoked by local actors wanting change, right? And others, the sky's the limit. So there's all these non-state actors who are involved in this anticipatory TJ process right now. It can't achieve everything, but it is preparing for the day. It is a long process, transitional justice. It has to start somewhere. So if it works or not, we can only know after a very long time. But maybe the junta trials in Argentina today would never have been possible without those victim associations, without the mothers and the grandmothers of the plaza in Argentina, Plaza de Mayo, doing what they did in the late 70s, right? So this is kind of the gist. And so if we go deeper into pre-transition TJ, yeah, this is what we can do. We as civil society, academia, etc., gather evidence, as we just spoke about, document. So gathering evidence is very proactive, right? Deposing people, maybe collecting things. Documenting is more passive, right? So evidence is already there, we just have to preserve it. We document. Truth-seeking. You have circles. You know, I know of a circle in London of Palestinians and Israelis who are there just sharing their own narratives, their own experiences of their family. We know that the Bereaved Family Forum have these processes ongoing for years where it's not truth in the sense of an investigative body who's going and doing forensic examinations. It's about the experiences of the individuals that are affected by the conflict. And it's a very important thing that civil society could do at this stage and is useful for later. Because you have exercised that muscle. That muscle has been exercised. It is there. It could provide a model for a national process. And also the mindset of the people in these smaller scale, bottom-up, grassroots processes. But there is a mindset change, and there's more openness for a more national, perhaps, process later. And the victims I mentioned before with Argentina, I mean, in Argentina, you had the lawyers and the mental health providers bring the first aid initially. They were the first responders. They always had the mental health people because the trauma gets worse over time, but also bringing the victims into the conversation from the outset gives them ownership over the process and legitimacy of the process. So these are things we can do now, and there are groups that are doing it now. And it will be useful for later. And create the space for healing. Start the process of reconciliation in whatever little bubbles you can do it. Develop models, as I said. Also, academics can study and on the paper sort of offer these contextualized concepts where, when the right leadership in place one day, they have something to use. The leaders are not going to commission an academic study of comparative research, and 4 years later, we're going to have the results. But if there's one already ready, the leadership might draw on it. And the turn to international institutions is something we could do now, and some of us are. So before I go to the slide on the international judicial institutions, and I have another 2 slides ongoing.
But it is making the sentence, it's never too early for TJ with a grain of salt.
It is extending the definition of TJ into the pre-transition stage. And I'll talk about another concept by Ruti Teitel, and she has an article on this, her genealogy article from TJ Genealogy from 2003, talks about the different generations of TJ, right? With the current generation of the current phase of TJ is a steady state. It's everywhere all the time. There's TJ all the time everywhere. You just have to look for it. Obviously, TJ is just a name to a collection of processes that we may call in different names, right? Accountability, exactly.
It's an umbrella term.
It's an umbrella term. And I think what's useful to think about is this duality. It looks back, but it tries to create a better future. And that will ground us back. Because you have lots of commemoration going on now, you have lots of accountability going on now. Are they both drawing on this idea of addressing the past to build a better future? Not necessarily. And for whom, right? Better future inclusive. Better future for the whole society, not for my family, right?
Exactly.
So it's this thing.
So it requires ripeness, society that takes time to develop.
Yeah. So you plant the seeds and you continue. And also after, I mean, look at South Africa. It was a promising case. And look, it didn't really go in the way we thought it would. There's a lot of criticism. It's not that the TRC didn't work. It did more than, we could expect such bodies to do. But right after it, and many years after the process and the recommendations, the Constitution itself is another example in South Africa. Right after the Constitution-making process and the Constitution outcome and the court and the TRC, this is not, a one-off. You continue to improve it and to implement it and to look at the deficits. So this is an ongoing, like democracy. It's not, we got it, we don't have to make an effort anymore. So that's the idea here. A couple of words on the potential or the already sort of impact or potential impact on transitional justice of the international judicial interventions is, again, Anne brought this up earlier, the documentation, right? It's documented. The ICC, the ICJ, it's documented. ICC has a bit more of an investigative kind of element. The ICJ just gets the submissions of the parties. And it could be lies. At any court of law, the parties come in with a bunch of lies. And then the truth comes out of this dialectic process. In the case of criminal trials, it's a, confrontation process. And you have a truth verification to everything at the end. But you've got the documents now. Maybe in 20 years, you start the verification. And the humanization of the victims, I think, is very important. And you see how, the hostage families went to the ICC. It's not that they're there to do all the things that people don't like the ICC for. They're there because they want to bring the face to the international public, the face of the victims. It's us. It's not just some number on a paper, right? So it's humanizing the victims. It's a very important function of these bodies. Evidence generating, not just documenting, but actually looking for and generating it. Delegitimizing leaders, very important. And again, this might not be in the short term. And in the Yugoslav case, it's, in Serbia, they're still celebrating Milosevic in some parts. He still has statues all over the place. Maybe it takes a few generations. So this is potential impact on TJ of judicial interventions going on currently on the international level vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine. I think this is really my one before last, and then we have time, right? More? We have half an hour? We have half an hour, no?
Yeah, we could put for questions.
Yeah, but they were also. So where do I see really opportunities? The door is open, not just me saying these things. There is this call for recovery, right? Shikum, recovery everywhere. In Gaza, obviously, it's recover the actual places, right? The infrastructure. In Israel, we're talking about social recovery, but the word recovery is everywhere now.
And physical.
Yeah, physical also, right? Not as extreme as Gaza. Yeah. So the word recovery is now the word, especially since the hostage return and the ceasefire coming into place. So this word recovery, what does it mean? Repair, recover, the language of TG really resonates with that. It's a real good sort of window and a entry point. Victims on both sides, on all sides. I don't know if there's only two sides, many sides. Victims are seeking recognition. They want truth. They want more recognition. They want to be held also as rights bearers, right? And we see this very clearly, and I won't go into examples. So this is where the language of TJ really gives them examples and tools and concepts. Constitutional moments on both sides, right? In Israel, we have it since the beginning of the reform proposals, before the war in Gaza started. And in Palestine, they have a basic law, and they've been talking about reform into a new constitution for a while, and they have the different rifts, Hamas, PLO, but they also have a lot of different social rifts in Palestine and in Israel. Constitutional moments, these are all opportunities. If there is a moment to sit down and redraft the social contract, this is where we can look at TJ for tools, for examples. How do you do it inclusive? How do you do buy-in, victims' participation? How do you do all these things? How do you...
Political situation turns it into a barrier, not an opportunity.
Well, we could talk about that. We could talk about that. There's always the blind spots. There's always, right, the political exploitation. But there's always the civil society who's there to uncover that. And we have the activists on the ground, as I mentioned, some of them with the documentation, but there's others like Standing Together, Combatants for Peace, Women Wage Peace, the Reeve Family Forum. These are reconciliation-focused organizations that are very active now, right? And we had Daniel Bartal in our webinar talking about 15% of civil society is pro-TJ. Looking at, he's the one researching these, right? He's a political psychologist, focused on the conflict, top authority on this. And we have the special rapporteur that I mentioned before. He has written a letter a few days ago. I don't know if people know that in Israel. He is on his website. After the current ceasefire came into force, he published on the website a call, Israel, Israelis, Palestine, Palestinians, come to me, I will help you. I have all this research, I have all these tools, all these expertise. We can do a TJ process, we can draft something, we can start conceptualizing. It's there on paper on his website. And the importance of long-term. I think people are now being aware, and there's more and more discourse I hear in Israeli society of what is the future for our children. I think it's more prominent than ever. In Rwanda, where I did a lot of research and work, I remember a lot of victims of the genocide, they were saying, I'm swallowing the reconciliation pill. I don't really forgive my neighbor for killing all my family. I'm doing it for my children. I don't want them to be raised in a society of hate, of revenge seeking, of even knowing about all these things to that extent, right, of what was done to him. I'm swallowing the reconciliation pill. I'm going through the motions. I'm playing the game for the future, for my children. And this is very strong in a lot of these transitional contexts. Colombia, Argentina, everywhere. So think about that. The language is here. It's already here. Conclusion, just for us to remember, what is TJ? Truth, justice, reparation, reform, but overall aims, sustainable peace, democracy, all the things we said. Never too early to start building this trust and accountability. Models can be contextualized. They should be contextualized, actually. And that peace and justice can evolve together. This isn't either or, and there's no sequence. So I wanted to end on this note, and we have time for more questions and answers. Go ahead. Thank you very much.
Div, you're first in line.
Hi guys. Hi, everybody. We haven't seen for a long time, so hey, everybody. And it's particularly fun to, I don't know if fun is the right word, but it's fascinating to listening to Sigall. And I'm totally committed. Sigall knows how much I was totally committed to this project. So for those reasons, and because of the high sympathy that I have to this paradigm, I will be critical. And I have two questions and two, I would say, sociological comments. The question is more about the international, the way TJ is now meeting the international legal order, and the comments are more internal Israelis. So regarding the questions, I think that one particular element that, in my view, was historically characterized transnational justice is the existence of sharp transitions. We can think about places like obviously South Africa and other places, right? And I think that was kind of an element that historically was more present, I would say, in the mid-19th of the last century than in current times. And I think that now, and also research is backing this argument, transitions are less frontal, they are more gradual. And for those reasons, you won't always find the right political climate that will enable a full-fledged transitional justice scheme. So I wanted to ask, this is a question, this is not a conclusion, but I wanted to ask if you share this notion, or and if that is something that makes you think about the plausibility of TJ. This is the first question. The second question is a little bit even more provocative. I don't know if provocative, but I was thinking to myself that I became angry on myself while articulating the question. Can we actually say that what Trump is doing currently at the region is some kind of alternative peacemaking TJ process, which frontally challenging the international liberal order and what it has to offer to the region, and to some extent maybe successful? So I'm thinking about some kind of I would have called it a populist TJ process, but we cannot ignore the fact that something is going on. And as one that is offering us the more classical paradigm, I would have loved to hear what you think about that. Two short questions, two short comments about the ripeness of the Israeli society towards this TJ processes. I think the first one is relating to the second part of your presentation, and that is that anticipatory transitional justice for me is a realist and a right way to go to. But I think that in all of the suggestions that were characterized there was not working with political elites. And I think that eventually in Israel and in many other states, but in Israel in particular, this is a field that I'm researching, I think that without changing attitudes and perspective and political imaginations within elites, you won't achieve nothing. And we are at the point in time in which even the most liberal political elite, and this is a paper that I'm working on here in the Minerva Center, even the most liberal political elite are totally not receptive towards not only I would say the paradigm of TJ, but also the notion that there's other ways which are not war and conflict to communicate with the other side. And last, short comment, even though once again we are sharing this notion and I'm committed to promote it, but eventually a lot of the internal Israeli discourse regarding tikkun, ichui, tshuva, all that is, and also many constitutional moments, so-called, that we had in the last 3 years are totally internal discourse and has no content and no context and no social discourse that connect between them and the conflict. So it may be the case that you need anticipatory constitutional TJ just to mitigate that, but you cannot ignore that. But thank you so much for that, and I'm all with you, of course.
Eli, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Sorry for not being with you, and I take this opportunity to congratulate ourselves for a nice and peaceful and transitional justice year. And it's really good that Sigall is opening this year with some more optimistic atmosphere, which might correspond to the place that we are now with the ceasefire and the return of the hostages. Two questions, Sigall. Thank you for a great presentation. First, transitional justice in internal as opposed to international conflicts. Okay, the examples that you gave, Argentina, South Africa, are internal. What we have here in the case of Israel and Palestine is much more complicated because we have both internal conflicts within Israel, internal conflicts within the Palestinian society, and the international conflict. And do you have any examples of transition justice process that encompasses all these factors together? And connected to this question is the question of measuring success, because all the examples that you show, Argentina, South Africa, Rwanda, are not places in which we can say, you know, we got to a situation in which the conflict ended and we are in a much better places. On the contrary, you know, there is a slippage in most of these places towards a more conflictual and problematic action or behavior or conduct. And, you know, if I compare this, for example, to post-World War II, where there was no transitional justice, there was justice on one hand and reconstruction, Marshall Plan, something like what Nadiv refers to Trump's action now. In a sense, the post-World War II processes were more successful in achieving both international and municipal or internal improvements than all the examples that you show that transitional justice was applied. So this is the second question.
Michael, behind you wants to talk. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much, Sigall. I'm kind of following up on Ellie's comments. And first, I wonder if there is a difference in the TJ field of research between TJ, I call it between societies or within societies, because with I think it's a more complex case. And to follow up on this, it seems that the historical cases of TJ you presented, there were clear perpetrators and clear victims. But here, like, everyone are victims and everyone are perpetrators to some extent. So how can you design a process where, like, everyone needs to share the stories of victimhood, and each side sees the other one as a perpetrator? And then I go back to the first question about recovery, and I will be maybe a bit blunt. In the Israeli-Palestinian case, why do I need the other side for recovery? I can recover as a society, recover myself without the other side. I mean, we'll finish we'll end the war, we'll finish the conflict, not the conflict, but the war. And I'm here, we are here, they are there, and we don't need to live together like in South Africa or other places. So what can we benefit from using TJ mechanisms or utilizing TJ mechanisms for recovery?
Just to answer the three and okay. Collect the other one.
All right. So, Nadiv first, no clear-cut transitions anymore. This is the situation, right? We're observing the situation. There's no more clear-cut transitions, and TJ is also more complicated. But even with the clear-cut transitions, you had this pre-transitional justice stage and the post. Again, Argentina started before, till now there's trials. So I don't really maybe understand the question, but the fact that the transition is not so clear-cut and may not be linear, by the way, yeah, doesn't say anything about the possibility of having TJ, yes or no. And as I said, like with the steady state TJ, you're always aspiring, even in a democracy, with peace, you're aspiring to improve democracy, to improve reconciliation. Look at Norway starting a TRC now to deal with the harms done to the Sami people. So this is where they want to, the integration is not so good, there's historical injustice, and they want to make some kind of reconciliation, or Canada with the indigenous. So all I'm saying is TJ is also not clear cut. It's about improving always and always being on guard in terms of your social inclusion, in terms of your reconciliation, and in terms of your democracy. And Trump is an alternative to international liberal order. Look, TJ isn't necessarily, I mean, it is a liberal agenda, obviously, but I think it allows for so much nuances that's not so complex. It's so adaptable. Obviously, you have TJ in places, that are not, don't have, the liberal democracy frameworks that we think about, and still it has brought more peace and a relative more democracy. And so I think that Trump's 20-point plan, it's populist, and it doesn't call directly for human rights, accountability, but there are a couple points in there that can provide a basis, for groups to rally for TJ on that basis. And I'm thinking about the points calling for Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. There's two of them. And there's even a mention of changing mindsets. What is that? What is changing mindsets? It doesn't just happen, change your mindset. And he's not talking about, put in place an education system, which will be changed a million times by different politicians in the future. But you can go in that point and say, this is a way to do it. There is data that shows that, truth commissions, etc., they operate in a way that allow the viewer to understand the complexity and see the perpetrators as human, etc., etc. There's all these attitudinal changes and psychological changes, etc. He also talks about coexistence, right, in these points. So again, how do you get from here to there? You need a process to bring you there. So every populist agenda, you could say that, right? So you got to have the activists to catch these words and say, look, let's raise funds to, implement point 18. Let's make it into an agenda now. Point 18. This is Trump's point, not mine. Let's do it. And this is a way. I think that the political elites must be part of this. Yes, they have to be part of it, but the political elites of tomorrow might be you and I and them, and the leaders of the demonstrations. We don't know who the political elites are going to be in a few years, and it's true that the current ones, they're not so amenable, at least on the Jewish side, to these ideas. Maybe support the Arab leaders. Yeah, they do have a lot of TJ language in their agendas. And new parties that are being formed, like Avon, I think they have a language that's but the mainstream, they're not there. And I don't think you will educate them to be there. But what you could do, if you have the force from below, is when there is a peace, when there is another Oslo agreement, you can bring in this provision of, in the future, there will be a TRC. This is what in Argentina they did with the Convention on the Right of the Child. I won't go into there, but you go and lobby in these documents that are being articulated, and you put a point there. You put a point, civil society activities will be going around reconciliation once the peace is implemented. And that's where you rally for the TRC. Any TJ has been internal. It's true. There are no good examples of international TJ, but let's start somewhere. It's being asked for, demanded. I mean, these international bodies that are offering to help or think about, they're saying, until now there haven't been good examples, but there's no reason to think there cannot be. I would say that there are some examples, not great, but there's a civil society reconciliation commission in the Balkan countries, former Yugoslavia, that's already for more than a decade active. But it's not really bringing great reconciliation, but it's growing. And there is, East Timor and Indonesia, they had a truth mechanism that included both countries, not considered a success story. I would say France and Germany after World War II is maybe a success story, not so prominent in the TJ literature, but there was a lot of reconciliation work. You know, joint programs, all these exchanges, learning each other's languages, and look at them now, right? So if you stretch your imagination, there are some. And when we talk about your second question, I will continue on this World War II example, post-World War II. You say there was no TJ, yet we have a success story, but there was TJ, right? When you look back at World War II, there wasn't the term TJ was not invented yet, but first of all, Nuremberg trials are classical TJ because they're selective, educational, supposed to be, right? They're about setting a new society. They're not just about retributive justice to everybody who perpetrator. Denazification, with all its different reiterations and attempts, is a vetting process that we now call lustration under TJ, and the commemoration and the vis-a-vis Israel. I mean, the Shinumim it's a reconciliation agreement with Israel. Actually, that's a cross-border example. Because that was Germany, Israel. It wasn't just monetary compensation. It was taking responsibility, acknowledgement. There was a lot of apologies. There's a lot of stuff in that, post-World War II agreement between Israel and Germany. So I think these are definitely transitional justice examples. Education, reformulating the education system. But of course, the Marshall Plan is one of them. There's no argument. But maybe alone it would not have brought the good results that the TJ has brought with the dealing with the past, the justice, the accountability, the, trials. And so success is hard to measure. You're right. I mean, I just mentioned post-World War II where you said it's successful, but maybe it's successful because of TJ. And success in Rwanda, look, there's no genocide in Rwanda. I don't know. I mean, that's pretty successful. Yeah, it's not a great democracy. Maybe there's a few disappearances here and there. And I'm being a bit cynical, but there's no genocide. And the genocide was not a one-off thing. It was not a 1994 genocide. It was a process that started in 1959 before independence of Rwanda, even more in 62 with independence. It was a process of pogroms leading to the genocide in 94. It was a long process. We're not anywhere close to that in Rwanda. And in Colombia, 50 years of fighting. We're not there. We're not going to be probably anywhere close to there in Colombia ever because of TJ. So yeah, I'm not saying it's a rosy picture, but it's improvement, and it's not linear. There might be some step backs, but you got to take it forward. You got to be active on it. And then Michael, internal, external. Sorry. All external, internal, same as what I said before. Not a lot of examples of external, but there is no reason not to invent the example. By the way, for some people, we're not external here. From the river to the sea, it's one unit. Your government thinks it's one unit. External, we're two ethnic groups. Fine, but we're on the same land, in a way, right? So, different ethnic groups, that's in many conflicts. Yeah, not Argentina, but Rwanda, South Africa. So, it's in that, broader picture sense, it's not different. And complexity, look at Colombia, look at stuff. I mean, there was a lot of complexity in Yugoslavia. I don't know if we're so special about complexity. Clear victim perpetrator lines, same. When the Truth Commission in South Africa, more black people came and apologized and took responsibility for what they did to white people in their acts of what we would call terrorism. They put a bomb in the bar. People died. Innocent people died. Some were white, some were black. Right? I don't think it's a clear cut. I mean, yeah, with apartheid, obviously, there was the line. But the individual stories, there were a lot of white victims being acknowledged and repaired and all that and healed in the TRC. And same in Colombia now. There's so many parties. This is not clean at all. Yugoslavia, I mean, you can unpack this more, but it's very unclear, this line, in many places. And recovery, can we recover alone? We can until another, big event happens. So we can recover for the next, year. Is that recovery? I mean, real recovery is going to be when there's no war here, no conflict here. And we're not alone also within Israeli society. We're not just Jews here. I mean, the Palestinians of Israel, the Arab citizens of Israel, they are part of the Palestinian nation. I mean, we're killing their cousins. How can we recover as an Israeli society without acknowledging that? I mean, that is that's the clearest question of answer for your question. I think that's all the questions answered.
I think we have to not think about how we can use TJ, but rather how we can create the conditions for TJ. Because when we talk about the Israeli situation and many ways, all kinds of that, the place is not ready for not only for TJ, or then the place is not ready for justice at all, or no one even wants. They just want security. They don't. Or they just can't think about no vision of justice at all. But I think we have to think about what are the conditions in order to bring about TJ. I think that's a long, steady ceasefire can be an important condition, but we have to think of other conditions for that.
Okay, I see that as a comment. I agree. I mean, that's part of maybe anticipatory teaching is creating the conditions. That's necessary to act to do that as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Sigall, it was fascinating, really fascinating. An old concept that we indeed could think about in different contexts. I was thinking of some of Michal's Bonnet de Bear group that I don't know whether you know about it or not, but it's certainly one on the internal level. One had an interesting interview looking at Trump's diplomacy and where those kind of points come in. We have to think about putting them to action. Thank you.
Thank you.